In the summer of 1981, inside a quiet block of military housing in Seaside, California, 12-year-old Mary Louise Day vanished from the one place meant to offer safety, her own home. There was no alarm raised, no hurried search, no report filed. Her room remained untouched, yet her presence seemed to dissolve overnight, leaving behind only silence. As the years passed, questions grew larger than the few answers anyone offered. How could a child disappear within her own family without a trace? And why did no one speak of it for decades? In the early summer of 1981, the Day-Ho family lived in a quiet area of military housing in Seaside, California. The rows of nearly identical homes, the trimmed grass, and the familiar sight of families moving in and out gave the neighborhood a sense of routine that rarely changed. People greeted one another politely, but kept their distance, as if the unwritten rule was to respect private matters behind each door. It was a place designed to feel stable, built for families who understood discipline and order. Yet inside one of those small houses, stability was more fragile than it appeared from the outside. Mary Louise Day, 12 years old, was the oldest of 3 sisters. She was a thin girl with observant eyes and a quiet presence, the kind of child who listened more than she spoke. Teachers remembered her as polite, careful, and often thoughtful, though sometimes tense in ways that were difficult to explain. Neighbors who saw her occasionally on the porch or walking toward the family car described her as gentle, keeping close to the doorway, as if unsure how long she was allowed to stand outside. She rarely lingered, and she rarely seemed at ease. Inside the home, Mary's world was shaped by her stepfather, William Howe, a military man whose firm tone and strict manner set the pace of the household. He treated Mary differently from her younger sisters. With them, he could be patient, even warm at times, guiding them through their small mistakes as children often make. With Mary, his voice shifted. He corrected her quickly, watched her closely, and spoke to her in a way that suggested he had little sympathy for her missteps. The difference was subtle to some, obvious to others, and deeply felt by Mary herself. She grew quiet around him, kept her shoulders slightly lowered, and often avoided meeting his eyes. Charlotte, Mary's mother, moved through the house with an anxious kind of care. She tried to keep peace, smoothing over small disagreements and distracting the children when William's mood tightened. Her voice rose and fell depending on the moment, but she rarely challenged him directly. There were evenings when she walked from room to room with a hurried gentleness, as if trying to prevent anything from disturbing the thin calm of the household. In the weeks before Mary vanished, several small things hinted at trouble. A neighbor recalled hearing raised voices one night, mostly from a man, with a softer, younger voice answering briefly. Mary's attendance at school had grown inconsistent, and her teacher received explanations that seemed incomplete. When Mary did appear outside, she stayed close to the door and returned quickly whenever William called her name. These moments formed a pattern that only became clear in hindsight. On Mary's final evening at home, the house followed its usual routine. Dinner was quiet. The younger girls played softly in their room, sorting their toys and whispering to each other. Mary stayed in the kitchen longer than the others, wiping the counter and carefully rinsing the dishes. William stood nearby, speaking in a low, firm tone that carried a hint of impatience. Mary answered quietly, her hands moving slower as if she wanted to avoid any mistake. Later that night, when the house had gone dark, Kathy, the middle sister, remembered hearing a few sounds from the hallway. Soft footsteps, the shift of something being moved, and a short, tense sentence spoken by their stepfather. She could not make out the words, but the tone made her stay still under her blanket. She did not get up to look, partly because she was unsure whether she was allowed to, and partly because the house felt unusually heavy at that moment. She drifted in and out of a light sleep as the sounds faded. The next morning, the quiet in the house felt different. The younger girls noticed first that Mary was not in her bed. Her blanket was pushed aside, as though she had left during the night, yet nothing in the room suggested a planned trip. Her shoes were untouched, her school books were neatly stacked, and the clothes she usually folded for the next day remained in their place. It was as if she had stepped out briefly and never returned. When they asked their mother where Mary was, Charlotte said she had gone somewhere for a while. Her tone was flat, not angry or worried, simply final. A few days later, she gave a different explanation, saying Mary might be staying with her biological father. There were no phone calls, no letters, and no clear details. William said little, only that Mary is not here anymore, with a tone that closed the conversation entirely. Days became weeks, and no one in the neighborhood saw Mary walking to school, playing outside, or visiting any of the nearby stores. In a community where routines were predictable, her absence should have stood out more. But families in military housing often came and went, and people assumed the Dehu family had arranged something privately. The small questions that some neighbors once held eventually faded, swallowed by time and the quiet nature of the community. Inside the home, however, the space Mary left behind was unmistakable. Her sisters remembered the unusual stillness of that morning, the way her bed looked, and the tone in their stepfather's voice the night before. They remembered their mother avoiding long conversations about Mary and encouraging them to focus on their schoolwork instead. As the years passed, these early memories settled into place like pieces of a puzzle they were too young to understand at the time. In the summer of 1981, nothing was reported, nothing was recorded, and nothing was searched. To those outside the home, Mary's absence blended into the quiet routines of a military neighborhood. To those inside, it became a silence that stretched over years, and from that night onward, no one ever saw Mary Louise Day again. When the first days passed without Mary returning, the absence seemed strange, but was met with little urgency inside the house. Charlotte continued with her daily routines, speaking in short answers whenever the younger girls asked about their sister, and William avoided the subject entirely, moving through the house with the same measured steps he always used. For the children, who had no control over what they were allowed to question, the silence became an unspoken rule, and their attempts to mention Mary slowly faded as they sensed the discomfort it brought to the adults. Outside the home, however, the earliest signs of concern came from people who had known Mary only through brief interactions. A neighbor noticed that her usual walk to the school bus stop had stopped abruptly. A teacher marked her absence several days in a row, then a full week, then longer, until Mary's name remained on the attendance sheet without any updates from her parents. When the school reached out to the family, they were told that Mary was staying elsewhere, though no specific details were offered. The explanation sounded incomplete, but in a busy school district with many families facing frequent moves, the matter did not escalate. Months passed without anyone outside the home hearing from Mary, and questions that were once soft curiosities grew into quiet doubts. A distant relative who visited the family noticed that Mary's belongings remained in her room, neatly arranged, as if waiting for her return. When he asked about her, Charlotte replied with a gentle but vague reassurance that she was away for an extended stay. William offered nothing more than a nod and a change of subject. The relative left the home with a lingering sense that something about the situation did not feel fully explained. By the early 1990s, the disappearance of Mary had blended into the past of the Deho household, a chapter that was rarely spoken of. Yet in 1992, during a routine welfare check involving an unrelated matter, a small piece of information began to shift the direction of the story. Someone familiar with the family mentioned that years earlier, The soil behind the old house had been disturbed in a way that seemed unusual. They did not claim anything specific, only that the timing had stayed in their mind because it occurred shortly after Mary was last seen. This comment, almost casual in delivery, caught the attention of the responding officer, although it was not part of the original inquiry. He took note of it, sensing that a detail connected to a child's disappearance, especially one never formally reported, deserved attention. When he ran a brief check, he discovered there was no record of Mary Louise Day ever being listed as missing. It was a rare occurrence, especially for a child of school age. The absence of documentation, instead of settling the matter, made it more concerning. With this new piece of information, the seaside authorities reopened the location where the family had lived more than a decade earlier. The property had long since been occupied by another family, but they agreed to allow access for the examination. Investigators focused on the area behind the house where the soil had reportedly been disturbed. The yard looked ordinary, with grass that had grown evenly over time, but professionals trained to notice small irregularities identified slight differences in texture and color beneath the surface. When the ground was gently examined, it revealed signs that the soil had once been shifted and then placed back in a way that did not match the natural layering of the surrounding earth. A trained dog brought to the property reacted consistently in the same area, not in a way that confirmed anything specific, but strongly enough to merit further investigation. Samples of the soil were taken for analysis, and although no clear object or traceable item was found intact, the samples contained biological material that suggested the land had been affected by human-related activity in the past. The results did not point to a definitive conclusion, but they raised significant questions about who had been on that property and for what reason around the time Mary disappeared. With this new information, investigators attempted to gather accounts from people who had known the family in 1981. They contacted neighbors, relatives, and individuals who had occasional interaction with the household. The patterns that emerged were subtle, yet consistent. Several people recalled that Mary seemed uneasy in the presence of her stepfather. Others remembered hearing tense moments from inside the home, and a few had always wondered why she suddenly stopped appearing outside. When authorities approached Charlotte for clarification, she repeated that Mary had gone to stay with her biological father. Yet there were no school records, no medical records, no reports of enrollment in any new location. Attempts to contact the biological father revealed he had not seen Mary in many years and did not know where she had gone. When investigators later spoke to William, his responses were short and guarded. He insisted that Mary had left the home and that the matter was not complicated. However, when pressed for details, he could not offer any clear explanation about when she left, where she went, or whether anyone had accompanied her. The inconsistencies between the parents' accounts, the lack of official documentation, and the unusual condition of the soil behind the former home shaped the early structure of the investigation. It became a case defined less by what was known and more by what was missing. There were no dates, no statements from Mary herself, no evidence that she had resumed school or contacted anyone after 1981. Even basic questions such as whether she left with belongings or without them could no longer be answered, because time had erased the small details that might have mattered most. As the investigation moved forward, the younger sisters, now older, began to recall moments from that summer more clearly. They remembered the sound of their stepfather's voice late at night, the sharpness in his tone, and the stillness that followed. They remembered the way their mother avoided the subject of Mary for years afterward. Each memory, though incomplete, added weight to the growing concern that Mary's disappearance had not been a simple family decision or a temporary stay with relatives. Despite these concerns, the early efforts to locate Mary reached a limit. Without a report from the time she went missing, without documentation of her movements, and without conclusive evidence from the property, the case entered a state of uncertainty. Investigators could outline possibilities, but they lacked the critical piece that could point them toward the truth. And as the months turned into years, Mary's disappearance once again slipped into silence, paused but never resolved, waiting for something, anything that might surface in the future and bring clarity to what had happened in that summer long ago. In the years that followed Mary's disappearance, the Deho household moved forward in a way that seemed outwardly calm, but carried a quiet heaviness beneath its daily routines. Time passed, school years changed, and the younger girls grew older, yet the space Mary once occupied felt like a corner of the home that had been closed off and left untouched. Her name was mentioned less with each passing season, until eventually it became something that hovered at the edge of conversations, present but seldom spoken. For a long period, the family lived as though Mary had simply faded out of their lives, without the clarity of whether she had chosen to leave or whether something else had taken her away. As children, Kathy and Sherry accepted the explanations they were given because they had no choice. But as they entered their teenage years, the early memories of that summer began to return with sharper edges. They remembered the unusual quiet in the house the morning after Mary vanished. They remembered their mother's strained expression and their stepfather's short responses. They remembered the way they had been told not to ask questions. With age came the realization that none of the reasons they had heard truly explained why Mary never wrote, never called, and never appeared again. It was in these later years, when they understood the world with more clarity, that both sisters began to feel a growing fear that Mary might not have left the home for another place at all. Kathy tried to hold on to hope, imagining that her older sister might have found a new life somewhere far away. She pictured Mary as someone who had slipped into a different environment, perhaps with people who cared for her, living quietly and safely. Sherry, however, felt differently. She carried a sense of unease that grew stronger the more she replayed that night from her childhood. She remembered the tone of her stepfather's voice, the unusual sounds that had reached her room, and how nothing in Mary's room suggested she had planned any kind of trip. When Sherry reflected on the small details, she found it difficult to believe that Mary had simply gone away by choice. For her, the silence surrounding Mary's absence felt like a sign that something had gone wrong, long before she was old enough to understand it. Outside the family, the community at Seaside had slowly begun forming its own conclusions. During the early 1980s, the neighborhood was accustomed to families coming and going due to military assignments, and at first Mary's absence seemed like another quiet transition. But years later, when people heard fragments of the story, that Mary had disappeared without a report, that her room had been left as though she had stepped out for a moment, that no one seemed to know where she had gone, memories began resurfacing among those who had known the family. Neighbors recalled the difference in how William spoke to Mary compared to the younger girls. They remembered seeing Mary rarely outside, and when she did appear, she often looked cautious, glancing toward the doorway as though she expected to be called back inside. A few admitted that they had sensed tension in the home, but had assumed it was a private matter they were not meant to interfere with. As the story resurfaced, certain comments circulated quietly among former neighbors. Some admitted they had always felt uneasy about how quickly discussion of Mary faded within the household. Others recalled moments when William seemed especially firm with Mary, his tone sharper, and his patience thinner than usual. While no one claimed to know what happened, the shared recollections formed an informal consensus. There had been something different about the way Mary lived in that home compared to her sisters. Over the years, these impressions solidified into a general suspicion that Mary's stepfather might have known more than he ever expressed. By the late 1990s, the family had moved to different locations, and contact with most of their former neighbors faded. Yet the memory of Mary stayed with those who had watched her grow up, however briefly. When the welfare check in 1992 first resurfaced the possibility that something unusual had happened, it was not only investigators who felt unsettled. People who had known Mary decades earlier found themselves revisiting old moments, realizing they had missed signs that might have held meaning had they been recognized sooner. Meanwhile, inside the family, Kathy and Sherry reached adulthood with different emotional paths, but the same unanswered questions. Kathy, who had spent years telling herself that Mary could still be out there, began looking for her in quiet ways, checking online directories when they became available, asking distant relatives if they had heard anything, and following small leads that led nowhere. Sherry, on the other hand, felt that every year without news made the possibility of Mary's return less likely. She did not express this belief openly at first, out of fear of upsetting her sister. But deep down she carried a solemn acceptance that Mary might never come back. The turning point came when a person who had known the family long ago spoke casually to an officer during a separate conversation, mentioning that they did not believe Mary had ever left the home safely. The comment was not intended to be accusatory, but it held enough weight to prompt the officer to revisit the limited material connected to the disappearance. In a case where almost nothing had been documented, even a passing remark became significant. As the small, scattered memories from neighbors, relatives, and the sisters themselves slowly connected, they formed a picture that was incomplete but troubling. It was a picture of a girl who rarely stepped outside, who seemed uneasy around her stepfather, who disappeared without taking any belongings, and whose absence was never reported. The story suggested not a planned departure, but a silence that had settled over the house the moment Mary was gone. A subtle but important discovery added to the unease. Among the paperwork connected to the family's time in Seaside, there was a receipt for outdoor supplies purchased around the same period Mary vanished. On its own, it meant very little. But when placed beside the memories of a disturbed patch of soil and the conflicting explanations from the adults in the home, the timing of that receipt became another detail investigators could not ignore. It did not prove anything, but it raised the same question that had been growing quietly for years. Why had so many small pieces not fit the story the family had told? As the timeline stretched toward the early 2000s, the case of Mary Louise Day remained without clear direction. The authorities had fragments, the community had suspicions, and the family had memories marked by confusion and worry. Yet none of it formed a complete answer. What lingered most strongly was the sense that Mary had not simply walked away from her life, and that the truth, whatever it was, had been buried beneath years of silence, waiting for the moment when something new would bring it back into the light. By the early 2000s, more than 20 years had passed since Mary Louise Day was last seen, and her name had become part of a family story told in hesitant fragments. The case had never grown into a formal investigation in the traditional sense, because it had never been officially reported at the time of her disappearance. Yet a handful of notes, a memory of disturbed soil, and conflicting explanations from the adults who once lived in the house remained in the background of local records, waiting for something substantial enough to push the matter forward. For years, nothing surfaced. Then, unexpectedly, in 2003, a development arrived from hundreds of miles away, in the form of a woman whose identity would raise more questions than answers. In Arizona, during a routine matter involving local authorities, a woman was asked to provide her name. She gave it calmly, without hesitation. Mary Louise Day. The date of birth she listed matched exactly the birth date of the child who had vanished from Seaside in 1981. To the officer handling the case, the name meant nothing at first. But when the information was entered into a database, a small alert appeared, not marking a missing person, but indicating that the name had been previously connected to a welfare inquiry in California decades earlier. It was an unusual flag, and unusual details tend to draw attention. Arizona authorities contacted their counterparts in California, who were familiar with the smaller pieces of Mary's unresolved story. The possibility that Mary had resurfaced after 22 years created both curiosity and caution. Without an original missing person report, there was no formal file to compare against, only recollections and the limited notes from 1992. Still, the idea that Mary might be alive and able to speak shifted the tone of the case entirely. In a situation where nearly all information was second-hand, a living voice could redefine the direction of the investigation. When California investigators traveled to meet the woman, they found someone modest in appearance, quiet, and somewhat guarded. She looked older than Mary would have been by that time, though age can leave its mark differently on each person. Her hair was pulled back neatly. Her clothes were simple. She carried herself in a cautious, almost reserved manner, as if unsure how closely she should allow anyone to stand near her. When asked to speak about her past, she paused often, taking time to shape her answers in a way that made investigators wonder whether she was choosing her words or struggling to remember them. Her recollections of her childhood were uneven. She could state her name and birth date, but when asked about details that most individuals remember easily, such as the layout of her childhood home, the names of teachers, or favorite places in the neighborhood, her answers drifted or stopped entirely. Sometimes she responded with uncertainty. Other times she gave a detail that seemed plausible, but did not align fully with what little was known. She mentioned that she had gone through difficult periods, though she did not describe them clearly, speaking instead in general terms about wandering, feeling unsettled, and trying to find a place where she felt safe. One moment stood out sharply. When investigators mentioned Seaside, the woman's expression changed noticeably. Her posture stiffened, and she lowered her gaze as though a memory had brushed too close for comfort. She said she remembered being there for a short time, but claimed she could not recall what happened during the period when Mary originally disappeared. The reaction was subtle but meaningful. For investigators who had spent years with only fragmented clues, even a small shift in body language carried weight. Arranging a meeting between the woman and Mary's family was essential. When Kathy met her, she studied the woman's face with an intensity shaped by decades of hoping, searching, and imagining. The woman in front of her shared some features of the sister she remembered. The shape of the jaw, a familiar angle of the eyes. Yet the differences felt striking. Kathy could not say definitively that the woman was not Mary, but she could not say she was either. The uncertainty created a quiet ache that settled in the room. Sherry reacted even more cautiously. The girl who had once shared a bedroom with Mary now stood opposite a woman who spoke with a soft, unfamiliar tone. Sherry listened carefully, searching for something she could attach to. An expression, a gesture, a small habit carried from childhood. But the more she listened, the more distant she felt from the person claiming the role of her sister. She later said that it felt like speaking to someone who understood the outline of Mary's life, but not the heart of it. To address the confusion, authorities arranged for genetic testing. The results confirmed that the woman shared a biological connection with Charlotte, Mary's mother. It was the strongest link the case had ever produced. Yet, even with this connection, investigators were careful not to declare the matter fully resolved. A biological match indicated relation, but it did not eliminate the possibility that the woman could have been another child of Charlotte, or a close family member whose existence had not been openly discussed. The result, though important, did not provide the certainty that everyone had hoped for. Instead, it deepened the complexity of an already unusual case. During a longer interview, the woman offered a short comment that caught the attention of those present. When asked what she remembered from her earlier years, she said quietly, "I went through something difficult in that place." She did not specify what she meant, nor did she elaborate when asked. Her voice grew softer, as if the subject itself was too heavy to approach directly. Investigators noted the statement carefully, but could not draw conclusions from it without further clarity. As the California team continued their evaluation, they compared the woman's statements with everything known from the earlier investigation. They examined the timeline of her life as she described it, but her account before the 2000s contained few concrete markers. There were no school records, no employment records, no residential history that could be traced. It was as though she had moved through the world without leaving a consistent trail. In cases involving long periods of instability, this was not unheard of, but it added another layer of uncertainty. By the end of their review, investigators found themselves facing a paradox. On one hand, they had a woman whose name, birth date, and biological connection all aligned with the missing child. On the other hand, her memories were vague, her timeline unclear, and her manner inconsistent with what surviving family members believed Mary would be like. This left the case at a standstill, where the possibility of resolution was present, but just out of reach, leaving behind questions that grew more complicated with each attempt to answer them. For the first time in more than 2 decades, Mary's story had a new chapter, not one that offered closure, but one that ensured the case could no longer remain in silence. The woman who claimed to be Mary had emerged, but whether she was the key to understanding the past or another unanswered question was something no one was yet able to determine. As investigators began piecing together the fragments of information gathered over 2 decades, the case reached a point where the past and present collided in a way that forced deeper questions. The woman who claimed to be Mary had introduced new possibilities, but she had also brought complications that no one had anticipated. Her presence did not close the case. It reopened it. And with that reopening came a careful, methodical review of every detail that had ever been connected to Mary's disappearance, from the disturbed soil behind the seaside house to the shifting explanations given by the adults who once lived with her. One of the first steps taken was a re-examination of the soil samples collected during the early 1990s. At the time they were taken, testing capabilities had been more limited, and the material had been stored with the hope that future advancements would provide clearer answers. When modern analysis was finally applied, the results showed that the biological material recovered from the dirt carried markers consistent with Mary's known genetic profile. The finding did not tell investigators exactly what had happened. The sample did not reveal a complete narrative. Yet the match was strong enough to confirm that Mary had been connected to the area behind the house after a point when she should not have been. It was a detail that pressed sharply against the explanations given in the past. With this updated information, investigators revisited the timeline of the Deho family's departure from Seaside. Records showed that the family moved away not long after Mary was last seen. There was no official notice explaining why she had not returned to school, and no documentation was provided to any administrative office about her new location. For most military families, transfers or moves were accompanied by paperwork that ensured children were accounted for, but in Mary's case, none of these ordinary steps had been taken. Instead, the family had simply continued on without her, a fact that seemed more unusual each time it was revisited. When investigators approached Charlotte again, her answers remained similar to what she had said years earlier. She insisted that Mary had gone elsewhere, and that she believed her daughter had been living in another household at the time. Though calm, her responses lacked details, and when asked whether she had ever attempted to locate Mary in later years, She offered reasons that drifted between uncertainty and resignation. She did not deny that she had lost contact. She only stated that she had accepted it as a reality she could do nothing about. It was a statement that left investigators with more questions than clarity. William, when questioned again, maintained a consistently short manner of speaking. He repeated that Mary had left the home and that there had been no reason for concern. However, when asked for specific dates or for the name of any person who might have come to take Mary, he could not provide answers. Instead, he offered general statements about family matters, about how children sometimes stayed with relatives, and about how it had been a long time since those events occurred. His reluctance to expand on any point made it difficult to evaluate the accuracy of his recollections, leaving investigators to rely heavily on the physical and timeline-based evidence, rather than his testimony. As part of the larger review, investigators took another look at the memories shared by neighbors and relatives. While these recollections were not formal evidence, they carried patterns that were hard to ignore. Many people remembered the noticeable difference in how William interacted with Mary compared to her sisters. Some recalled moments of tension in the home, moments they had dismissed at the time because they believed it was not their place to intervene. One neighbor mentioned seeing William outside on a warm night around the period of the disappearance, moving something heavy with a determined expression. They had not thought much of it at the time, assuming it related to home repairs or yard work, yet the detail now sat uneasily alongside everything else. Investigators also compared the statements given by the woman claiming to be Mary against the known elements of Mary's childhood. Her stories held gaps large enough to raise doubts, but they also included general memories that could plausibly belong to someone who had lived in Seaside during that time. The difficulty lay in the lack of specifics. When asked about her final months in the home, she avoided the topic entirely, either from uncertainty or unwillingness. Her hesitance made it impossible to determine what parts of her story were shaped by true memory and which were influenced by information she had learned later, intentionally or otherwise. The most challenging aspect was that her connection to Charlotte, confirmed through biological testing, kept the case poised between resolution and further mystery. It suggested she belonged to the family, but did not clarify who she was within it. The possibility that Mary had survived and lived through years of instability remained open. So did the possibility that another child related to Charlotte, unknown to the sisters or the community, had taken on Mary's name at some point. With so few records and so much time lost, either scenario felt possible from a purely investigative standpoint. As investigators followed these paths, they found themselves returning repeatedly to the same core question. What had happened in the Day Howe home during the summer of 1981? Every avenue, every interview, every memory, every piece of preserved material ultimately led back to that period. The soil sample hinted at a connection that should not have been there. The sudden move raised concerns. The lack of any records following Mary's disappearance strengthened the suspicion that she had never been relocated as claimed. The inconsistencies in the adults' explanations cast shadows over the events they described, and the behavior of the woman claiming to be Mary left an unsettled feeling of truths only partially spoken. By the time investigators completed this phase of the review, the narrative had become clearer in some places and more complex in others. The evidence did not point directly to a single conclusion, but it strongly indicated that the original story, Mary leaving home willingly and living elsewhere, did not align with what the collected details now suggested. Something significant had happened in 1981, something that had altered the course of Mary's life. Whether the woman who appeared in 2003 held the key to that truth, or was herself part of another unsolved chapter, remained an unanswered question. What was certain was that the case could no longer be regarded as a simple family matter from the past. It had grown into something that demanded a deeper understanding, one that investigators knew would require confronting uncertainties that had lingered unchallenged for over 2 decades. When investigators reached the stage where evidence, interviews, and modern testing had all been re-examined, they faced the challenge of determining what could be taken further within legal boundaries. The disappearance had occurred more than 20 years earlier, at a time when no official report had been filed. This absence of documentation, more than any other factor, shaped the direction of the case. Without a formal record of Mary being missing, the investigation stood on unusual ground, where authorities had to reconstruct events without the foundation normally required for legal action. It was a position that placed more weight on inferences than on established procedure, and that alone created a barrier difficult to overcome. The first legal obstacle involved determining whether Mary's disappearance could be classified under any established category. Normally, a missing person report created a trail. Paperwork, follow-up notifications, and official acknowledgement that allowed future investigators to take action. But in Mary's case, the earliest timeline existed only in the memories of neighbors and family members. That lack of written record meant there was no starting point for legal intervention. A situation that began without documentation was now being examined decades later by professionals who needed documentation to move forward. The contradiction was not lost on anyone involved. When the question of possible legal action regarding the biological material found behind the seaside home was raised, investigators concluded that the sample, though meaningful, did not reach the level required to support a formal claim. It indicated that Mary had been at that location at a point when she should not have been, but it did not clarify the nature of the event connected to the soil. There was no identifiable object, no clear marking, and no preserved structure that could be used to establish a concrete timeline. Without more, it was impossible to determine whether the disturbed earth suggested an accident, an unreported medical issue, or something entirely different. This lack of clarity placed the finding in a category of noteworthy but not conclusive, which offered insight but not legal direction. Investigators also reviewed the statements of Charlotte and William to determine whether inconsistencies provided grounds for formal suspicion. Charlotte's interviews, though vague and often shifting, did not contain direct contradictions strong enough to justify legal action. Her uncertainty over the past, particularly over details she had not discussed in many years, made the reliability of her memory difficult to measure. William's statements, short and reserved, were equally frustrating from an investigative standpoint. His reluctance to expand on his recollections made it difficult to contest or verify anything he said. Yet hesitation alone could not be used as a basis for action, especially without evidence linking him to a specific event. In legal terms, suspicion could not replace substantiation. The presence of the woman who claimed to be Mary added a separate layer of complexity. Legally, the genetic match linking her to Charlotte held significant weight, but it did not clarify whether she was indeed Mary. Without supporting records from her earlier years, and without a clear timeline before the early 2000s, her identity could not be established through the usual process of verification. The conflict between biological connection and inconsistent memory made her position unusual. She was both central to the case and beyond the ability of investigators to fully define. From a legal perspective, she could not provide the foundation for further action because her statements did not confirm a sequence of events, and her history prior to adulthood remained undocumented. Faced with these limitations, investigators began shaping the case into a set of official hypotheses. These hypotheses were not conclusions. Rather, they were organized summaries of what the available information most strongly suggested. The first hypothesis proposed that Mary had left the home voluntarily or through informal arrangements, then experienced many years of unstable living conditions, leading to gaps in memory. This explanation aligned with the presence of the woman in 2003 and her fragmented account of her early life. It allowed for the possibility that Mary had lived outside typical systems, without school records or medical documentation, before eventually coming into contact with local authorities in Arizona. Such a life trajectory, though difficult, was not impossible. The second hypothesis took a more cautious approach. It proposed that the woman in 2003 could have been another individual biologically related to Charlotte, someone whose existence had not been publicly known or documented. Under this scenario, the real Mary might not have survived past the early 1980s, and the soil findings behind the seaside home could represent the last physical trace connected to her. This hypothesis did not assign responsibility to any person, but acknowledged that the timeline raised concerns. It left open the possibility that Mary's disappearance had not involved relocation, as previously stated, but instead involved an unrecorded event within the home. A third hypothesis suggested that Mary might have been relocated by someone outside the immediate household, either temporarily or permanently, in a way that was never properly documented. Under this explanation, the adults may have believed Mary was staying elsewhere safely, even if no clear paperwork supported the move. This scenario could account for the family's vague explanations and the lack of formal reporting. However, it did not explain why no contact occurred afterward or why the family did not attempt to locate Mary in later years. None of these hypotheses could be confirmed or dismissed with the available information. When investigators presented their findings for internal review, the case was classified under a category used for situations where identity is partially confirmed, but the events surrounding the disappearance remain undefined. It was a designation meant for cases where the narrative could not be completed, and yet could not be fully closed. Throughout the legal evaluation, one consistent detail continued to surface in the minds of those reviewing the findings. The night sounds remembered by the younger sisters, the disturbed earth behind the home, and the quick move out of Seaside by the Deho family. These details did not point to a specific act, but they formed a sequence of moments that suggested the original explanation, that Mary had simply left, was incomplete. While suspicion focused quietly on William due to his manner, his treatment of Mary, and the recollections of neighbors, no statement or piece of evidence reached the threshold necessary for legal action. The law required clear, demonstrable connections. The case offered only questions. In the end, the investigative team noted that the case remained open in principle, but could not move forward without new information. The file was left with a summary, acknowledging that Mary's status could not be conclusively established, and that the woman from 2003, while biologically connected to the family, did not resolve the inconsistencies surrounding the events of 1981. The unanswered questions were not seen as failures of effort, but as the natural consequence of time, silence, and the absence of early documentation. For investigators who had spent months piecing through decades of uncertainty, the result was not closure, but a recognition of the limits of what could be proven. The truth of what happened in the Deho household during that summer remained somewhere between memory and possibility, waiting for a detail that had not yet come to light. As the investigation reached its practical limits, life moved forward in ways that were both ordinary and quietly waited for those who had lived through Mary's disappearance. The official file remained open but without direction, resting in a space where further progress depended on new information that had not surfaced in more than 2 decades. While the authorities stepped back, The people closest to Mary continued carrying their own versions of the story, each shaped by memory, doubt, and a kind of quiet endurance that had grown over the years. Kathy, now an adult with a life shaped by responsibilities of her own, still felt the presence of her sister's absence in moments she could not predict. She tried throughout the years to hold on to the idea that Mary might still be somewhere, living in a quiet way that did not leave a trace. She viewed the woman from 2003 with a careful balance of hope and hesitation, neither fully accepting nor rejecting the possibility that her sister had returned. In conversations with those she trusted, she often said that the most difficult part was not knowing, a feeling that stayed with her more persistently than sadness. She believed that even a small piece of truth, once found, could help settle the long stretch of uncertainty that had followed her since childhood. Sherry, on the other hand, carried her understanding differently. While she did not dismiss hope entirely, her memories of the night Mary disappeared had shaped her in a way that made acceptance more difficult. She remembered the sounds, the tension, and the atmosphere inside the house during that time. These memories left her with a quiet belief that Mary's journey had ended long ago, and that the unanswered questions were not about her sister's present, but about her past. When she met the woman who identified herself as Mary, she searched for signs, small expressions, familiar gestures, that might connect the woman to the sister she had once shared a room with. Yet the distance she felt during that meeting remained with her afterward, guiding her toward the conclusion that the woman, though connected to her family by blood, might not be the sister she had lost. Charlotte carried her own silence through the years. For reasons she rarely expressed, she did not speak openly about the details surrounding Mary's disappearance. When approached by investigators, she answered calmly, but her responses lacked the depth that might have come from reflection or reconsideration. In the lives of her remaining children, she tried to maintain stability, focusing on daily routines rather than the questions that hovered around her eldest daughter's story. With time, her silence became something people around her accepted, even if it left significant gaps in the understanding of what had happened. The woman who claimed to be Mary continued living quietly in California after her interaction with authorities. She avoided public attention and chose not to participate in additional inquiries. Her life in the years after 2003 was marked by modest routines, staying outside the reach of questions she did not appear ready to answer. Whether her reluctance came from uncertainty, discomfort, or experiences she preferred not to revisit, no one knew. Her presence in the story remained significant, yet incomplete, like a page that had been written but not connected clearly to the rest of the book. For those who had followed the case from the outside, the story of Mary Louise Day served as a reminder of how silence in the early stages of a disappearance can shape the course of an investigation for decades. Without early documentation, without witness statements taken at the moment they mattered most, the truth became harder to find with each passing year. Investigators who had worked on the case spoke cautiously about this, emphasizing that even small decisions in the beginning, what is reported, what is overlooked, what is explained in brief terms, can determine what answers remain possible later. Yet, despite the lack of closure, the story left behind something enduring. In the home of one of the sisters, a simple wooden frame held a photograph of 3 young girls sitting together on a porch step, their faces bright with the ease that childhood often brings. It was one of the few photos where all 3 appeared together, and it stayed on display not because it solved anything, but because it captured a moment untouched by the uncertainties that came later. The picture served as a quiet reminder of the life Mary had once lived, of the connections she had shared, and of the hope, however small, that those connections might someday lead to a clearer understanding of her fate. In conversations that happened years later, One of the sisters reflected on the long journey that had defined their family's story. She said that what she wished for was not a perfect ending or a dramatic revelation, but simply the truth, spoken plainly, so that the silence that had followed them from childhood into adulthood might finally settle. It was a sentiment that captured the essence of what remained unresolved, a hope not for rewinding time, but for understanding it. To this day, the case of Mary Louise Day rests between possibility and uncertainty, shaped by memories, by incomplete accounts, and by a single appearance in 2003 that raised as many questions as it answered. The truth may exist somewhere in the spaces between what was said and what was left unspoken, waiting for a detail that has yet to surface. And until that detail appears, Mary's story remains suspended, neither closed nor fully open, held in place by a past that has not yet revealed everything it holds. If this story left you with questions, share your thoughts below. What do you believe happened to Mary Louise Day? Your perspective keeps these cases remembered. Like, subscribe, and follow for more detailed true crime investigations. Your engagement helps bring forgotten stories back into view.